Hi guys, TotallyDubbed here, and today I'm doing a video review on the Samsung HW-Q60T soundbar. Now this soundbar can be found for around £500 in the UK and around $450 in the US. If you live in these territories or indeed elsewhere, the locally link in the description below will take you to your localized Amazon store. So without further ado, let's get into it. So first off, let's talk about the build quality and design. Now the product dimensions will be on your screen right now, but what you can see potentially from my setup is that the soundbar is pretty nice and sleek, so therefore it should fit under most TV setups, or at least in my case it will fit in terms of a on a TV stand. Now there is a wireless subwoofer. In terms of wireless, it's wireless between the soundbar and the subwoofer, but it does need to be plugged into the wall just in case you are wondering. So yes, this does come with a subwoofer as well. Now in terms of the design of the soundbar itself, it's got a full metal grille all the way around the soundbar, which I like to see. In terms of an LED, there's a little LED indicator which can be found on the right hand side over here, and that indicates, let's say, the input or let's say the volume. There are 4 physical buttons at the top of the soundbar: power on and off, volume up and down, and changing input, which is pretty standard, but it's good to see it included in this soundbar as well. Now in terms of the inputs and outputs, well, you've got a power input over here. It's a proprietary connector. You've got USB playback, you've got 2 HDMI ports, one of which is your HDMI ARC, and this is also eARC compatible, so for those who are wondering in terms of more modern day setups. And then you've got optical as well. It's also worth knowing that you have got Bluetooth connectivity, and it's great to see the AAC codec included within this soundbar as well. There's no Wi-Fi connectivity, so it's worth bearing that in mind, at least according to Samsung and from what I could see, but that shouldn't concern most people because I presume you'll be connecting via HDMI instead. Next up is the remote control. Now the remote control, for those who are aware, hasn't changed for years, but why fix something that isn't broken? The remote control feels good. It's got a good size to it and a good weight to it. Through it you've got a whole host of functionalities: on and off, change of inputs, you can pair to your Bluetooth device, control media, and also adjust the sound modes, which I'm going to touch upon in a bit. In terms of settings, you've got bass, treble, and also in terms of virtual, so you can, if you press it over here, you'll be able to see it appear, hopefully if my camera picks it up, but there we go. And then other than that, you've got the woofer control, which is in other words a subwoofer, and then the volume as well. So all the right functionalities, and I like the fact that Samsung have included this in this model as well. And now we get onto the sound quality of the soundbar. Now first off, I just want to talk about quick top line specs. You can see these from Samsung's website, but in case you don't want to visit it, it's got 360 watts of total power, 5.1 channels, and 9 speakers in total. Now it's worth bearing in mind that Samsung also are kind of marketing this Q Symphony feature. The Q Symphony feature essentially allows the soundbar to sync itself to a relevant Samsung TV, and therefore allows you to play back the TV speakers alongside the soundbar. Now I don't have a compatible TV, so I can't talk about that, but it's just worth bearing in mind. The models will be listed on this video over here, and you can see it through Samsung Soundbar, and I'm sure with later models that come out, they'll also include this Q Symphony feature, which syncs with the Q60T soundbar. Now in terms of codec support, this supports Dolby 5.1 and DTS Virtual X. Now this isn't to be confused with DTS-X or Dolby Atmos. Those are the kind of cinematic type of experience that you might want to get in more premium soundbars, but this does not support that. Now in terms of the DTS Virtual X, it's actually potentially one of its best features, and it's quite nice to see it included with the Samsung soundbar. Now before I get into my assessment, be it from the movie performance to sound quality, what I'm going to do is give you a bit of a demo. So the song I'm going to be playing is from Priya. The song name is Falling. You can listen to it as a reference if you so wish. She's my friend. Great song, as subjectively speaking. But here I'll be cycling through the different sound modes and hopefully give you an idea of what the sound modes do, and then I'm going to explain as to my own subjective opinion about it. When I reach the brink, don't stop, we sink, and now I'm falling, 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 falling again. Next thing you know, I'm crawling, crawling, I'm falling from so high, It's a matter of time, I'll get over the smile. Just gotta feel my right. So there you had a bit of a demo. Now, I'm going to straight away talk about its music performance because we just came from a music clip, so I think it's pretty fitting in this respect. Now, first off, the standard mode, I just think is a little bit lackluster. No matter what you're watching, be it the BBC News to watching a movie like Transformers to listening to a song like Priya's song, I just wasn't taken away from standard mode. Move on to surround mode, again, it just sounded a little bit odd. It sounded a bit, the spatial awareness just seemed a little bit off, and the center channel just seemed to be completely non-existent. So I would dismiss these modes altogether. Next up is Game Pro. Now, the name would suggest Game Pro and therefore it's suited for gaming, but I actually found it quite useful when it came to watching terrestrial TV. Now, we're talking about music here, right? So what's the best mode? Well, we've got the two remaining modes. Adaptive sound, which is what Samsung uses AI in order to detect what's on the screen and therefore give you the best sort of sound experience. And then you've got this DTS Virtual X. Now for music, specifically for music, I preferred adaptive. Why is that? Well, purely because DTS Virtual X somewhat drowned out the mid-range, and when it comes to vocal tracks, let's say like Priya's track where you've got vocals and you've got instruments, it just felt that the vocals were somewhat drowned out and a little bit lost, and I didn't like that. When I went through different tests through YouTube or through my phone playing via Bluetooth, I just wasn't impressed by the overall DTS Virtual X. However, there is a kind of caveat to this. DTS Virtual X does add a layer of immersion which isn't present in any of the other sound modes. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword. I like the surround sound effect and the soundstage that DTS Virtual X brought, but I didn't like the fact that how it drowned out the mids, specifically when it comes to listening to music. Now, next up from music was BBC News. So I used BBC News Regular and then BBC News HD in order to see how it would cope with the digital Dolby digital codec. Picks it up perfectly, and I had no issue it's playing back the better quality codec and therefore the better quality sound. Now, in this respect, I somewhat preferred the DTS Virtual X mode, simply because it added a bit more of that immersion that I talked about, and when it came to news, it made it a little bit easier to listen to. Weirdly, Game Pro actually was really good when it comes to dialogue only. So if you watch a lot of news or podcasts or let's say commentaries like on YouTube as a review, Game Pro actually is a pretty good choice. Again, subjectively speaking, but it's up to you in terms of what you find best. Next up came movies. Now movies here, DTS Virtual X with that surround sound type of more better immersion was far superior than any of the other modes. All the other modes sounded a bit too claustrophobic, a little bit too close sounding, and didn't have that sort of instrument separation and width and depth that I wanted from this soundbar. At £500, I expected that. So DTS Virtual X added that layer of immersion that I was kind of craving in the other sound modes. Now, aside this sound modes, what about its actual sonic performance? How does it do throughout the frequency range? So first off, let's talk about the sub bass. Now here, the soundbar tails off at 42 Hz, which means that when it comes to that sub bass extension, that low end rumble that you want, it's somewhat missing. In comparison to Samsung's older models or more premium models, what you'll find is they will extend a little bit better. In comparison to other models out there from other manufacturers, again, these ones, such as from JBL, will extend a lot lower and give you that more rumble that you might want in movies. At this price range, I would expect this soundbar to reach around 38 Hz or below. Unfortunately, 42 Hz is not so to say an excuse, but I just really wish they extended it a bit lower. Now, as for the mid bass, I was actually pleasantly surprised. What this soundbar does is that it deals with the control and precision extremely well, which isn't something that I could say about all soundbars out there on the market, specifically at its price range. What I found is the Q60T does a great job in dealing with the mid-bass frequency. It doesn't drown out the mids, well, not too much, and also doesn't make it sound wobbly or overly bassy. Now you can tailor this through the EQ, and the woofer setup is great, but I was actually surprised to find that I didn't actually have to tailor it all together. I just left it on 0 because I found that in my room it did it did sound really good in terms of that frequency, the mid-bass frequency. Now moving on to the mid-range, here it was, well, kind of expected. A little bit of a drowned out mids, a little bit pushed back, a little bit recessed. It doesn't come across as clearly as more premium soundbars. and yet it does sound a little bit clearer than cheaper soundbars. So it's somewhat to be expected that this somewhat mid-range soundbar performs mid-range in its mids. That's a lot of mids. But what I'm trying to say over here is that the mid-range could have been a little bit better. You can EQ it, but when you do EQ it, it does sound a little bit too artificial, a little bit artificially boosted, and therefore doesn't come across as nicely. And then moving on from there, if you're going to be listening to dialogue and stuff, you can use those modes that I mentioned before, like let's say Gain Pro, which brings out the mid-range a little bit more. So I was not overly impressed, but neither was I overly disappointed. As for the highs, now this has up to 20 kilohertz frequency range, which is as much as the human ear will be able to hear. And in this respect, I was perfectly happy with it. Now, of course, specs are one thing, real world performance things are a completely different thing. And in my case, I was pleasantly surprised. It had a good sort of extension. It didn't feel like it was rolled off too much, and it didn't feel like it was sibilant, so therefore it was kind of harsh on the ears, and therefore you had to tone down the treble. Again, here I left the treble at 0 on its EQ setting, which was somewhat surprising because previously in Samsung's older generation soundbars, I had to dial up the treble by 2 or 3 notches. So it's great to see that Samsung have kind of paid attention to this, and it kind of makes sense given that if you're going to watch TV, there's going to be some dialogue. And finally, to conclude this sound section is the Soundstage itself. So the width, the depth, the positioning. Now here I was not too taken away. With DTS Virtual X, don't get me wrong, I really like that extra immersion. It somewhat reminded me of Samsung's older N650, which I think uses somewhat of the similar technology, the acoustic beam technology by Samsung. Here I felt that it did add that layer of immersion. But as I mentioned before, if you take away DTS Virtual X, that soundstage, that width and depth pretty much gets completely decimated and sounds really claustrophobic. So if you're going to use this soundbar DTS Virtual X, then yeah, the soundstage is going to be good, you've got a good width and depth, and you've got decent instrument separation. Take that away, then you really are left with a soundbar that makes you wanting a bit more. At £500, I'd expect better instrument separation. On the standard mode EQ, for example, it just sounds way too single directional, and it just didn't come across as what I wanted it to do. For £500, I would have expected more from Samsung, specifically because of their experience on soundbars and specifically of their older models. So I was a little bit left disappointed over here, and again, depends on the mode you use, but on the whole, not too impressive in terms of soundstage. So what's my verdict of the HW-Q60T? Well, quite frankly, it's somewhat of a mid-tier soundbar, and it's very much reflected in the price it comes at in Samsung's range. The thing is here, it's got competition. It's got competition from a whole host of different manufacturers, and if you're wanting to know some alternatives, do check out in the description below, including from Samsung themselves. The N650, if I'm not mistaken, which is about 2 years old, is still available. Now, I don't know how long it'll be available for, because often when I do these reviews, 1 year later, people are still watching, and therefore that model is completely discontinued. So my suggestion personally would be to go with the HW-N650. It's around the same price tag, a little bit cheaper. Yes, it doesn't have some sort of features that this Q60T does, but if you're someone like me who doesn't have the Q Symphony feature and you just want something that sounds good and does great overall, then that's the soundbar that I would personally suggest to you guys. Again, since that time there's been a lot of other soundbars, and they do give this soundbar a very good run for its money, and in fact could be somewhat better recommended by myself or others in comparison to the performance. So there we have it. It's okay. It's not great, it's not bad, it's not terrible. It's somewhat in the middle ground, and that's the best sort of honest, unbiased, unpaid review and opinion I can give you guys, and hopefully this video has been helpful in order for you to make an informed decision yourselves. So if it has, make sure you give it a like, subscribe to see more, favorite and share if you feel this will be helpful to your family and friends looking for a soundbar around $500. Alright guys, I've been Totally Dubbed, take care and bye bye.